army commanded by the famous Italian strategist Ambrogio Spinola, sent by the Spanish crown, arrived at the Dutch town of Breda on the 27th of August 1624. Spinola came to stay, and he began a siege characterized by supply shortages, a tight encirclement of the city, and various attempts to supply and relieve the town. The siege of Breda is considered Spinola's greatest success, and one of the last major Spanish victories in the 80 Years' War. It is also one of only few early modern sieges that made it on TV, namely in the historical fictional movie Alatriste, starring Viggo Mortensen. This is how contemporary historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Breda. After a long truce of 12 years, the 80 Years' War between Spain and the United Provinces of the Netherlands recommenced in 1621. At the time, the 7 United Provinces fought for their independence from the Spanish crown, who controlled big parts of what is modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. When the Spanish renewed the war, they didn't want to bring down the Dutch Republic by armed force, but to revive the commercial life in the Spanish Netherlands. They embargoed Dutch trade and committed their armada to suppressing Dutch naval activity. Central to this strategy were the so-called Dunkirkers, Dutch privateers in Spanish service, who operated from the ports of Dunkirk, Ostende and Newport. This was so effective that the Dutch Republic was soon under immense financial and strategical pressure. Even more so when the Dutch allies, France and England, made peace with Spain. Because both the Dutch and the Spanish kept to a policy of defensive warfare, the struggle was largely confined to the southern approaches of the Maas-Waal line, which runs along 2 rivers in the center of the Netherlands. Both sides confined themselves to the rather passive siege routine established in the earlier decades. According to the expert on siege warfare Christopher Duffy, the sieges of the time were vast, predictable and dull, followed constantly recurring methods and lacked technical innovation. The one man to retain his fighting spirit was the famous military commander Ambrogio Spinola, an Italian strategist in Spanish service. He was no fan of defensive ways of warfare, and his plans were very aggressive. At first, the Spanish government was concerned about this and worried about the immense cost of the concurrent 80 and 30 Years' War. Despite lacking money and supplies to put all his plans into practice, Spinola took the city of Jülich in early 1622 and then advanced west to attack Bergen op Zoom. However, here he bit off more than he could chew. His army, poorly paid and in a mutinous mood, captured a few outworks of the town, but then had to abandon the siege because the relief force of the Republic arrived. After this defeat, which chipped away both at Spinola's public image and ego, he took some time to reform his army and to recruit more men. In spring 1624, the great strategist sat in Brussels, preparing for his last siege in the Netherlands, the Siege of Breda. Breda was a rich town in northern Brabant. It was one of the strongest fortresses in the defensive line of the Republic. This made it a difficult but interesting target. Conquering Breda would give the Spanish a strong position to defend Spanish Brabant and deprive the Republic of a base from which the Dutch were making regular raids into Spanish territory. In addition, it could serve as a bridgehead for the occupation of further strongholds in the area, such as Bergen op Zoom, and improve the Spanish position in case of peace negotiations. When first rumors of a coming siege arose, the city prepared itself. Its garrison of 11,500 men was supplemented by an additional 5,200 soldiers. In addition, able-bodied citizens were recruited and armed so that a militia of 1,800 men supported the professionals. The governor of Breda, Justinus van Nassau, an illegitimate son of William of Orange, watched the preparations of the town closely. Supplies for a siege of 1 year were stocked in the city. Most importantly, weapons, powder and food. Breda was a compelling target, but not one easily taken. Spinola left Brussels on the 23rd of July 1624. still without approval of the Spanish crown, and after 5 days arrived near Breda. To obscure his intention, he split his army and sent Hendrik van den Berg to the east of the Republic, while the main body of the army set up a temporary camp between the villages of C.W.A.M, Barle and Gilze. While Spinola's men already struggled because of supply problems, their presence didn't cause much concern in the Republic. It was still unclear whether the Spaniards would attack Bergen-op-Zoom, Breda or Grave, and the people were confident that the strengthened garrison was sufficient to defend Breda. It is not entirely clear how many men Spinola actually had at hand. The historians ROOZE and EIMERMANN estimate that about 40,000 were deployed at the end of September 1624. By continuously arriving reinforcements, the besieging army had been growing to 80,000 by the beginning of May 1625. About 10% were cavalry, and the army brought at least 30 guns to fire at the town. Guns which they desperately needed, since the already formidable defenses of the town had been strengthened even further. Breda was in a strategically favorable location at the river Mark and several important roads. Nature was the foundation of its defenses. The woods in the vicinity of the town seriously hampered the movement of horsemen and artillery, and several rivers, most importantly the Mark and the A, formed an obstacle for besiegers. The areas north and south of the city could be flooded by opening 2 sluices. Beyond that, the man-made defenses of the town were in a formidable condition. They had been renewed and extended in 1587 and 1622. At the time of the siege, the city was guarded by thick and high walls of earth, as was common with fortresses in the Netherlands. 15 bastions provided space for numerous cannons and were arranged to cover every angle of attack. The ditch, which was fed from the river Mark, was between 55 and 117 meters broad and housed several ravelins. On 2 places, the curtain wall was enhanced with cavaliers, heightened artillery platforms, and a fausse bret, which was a small wall outside the main wall. A strong covered way provided further protection. Hornworks, also surrounded by a ditch and palisades, protected the 4 city gates and the monastery. All in all, Breda was a textbook example of defensive military engineering. It didn't take Ambrogio Spinola, with all his experience, long to recognize that these defenses would be hard to break through, and he couldn't take the city by stratagem or bribery. The only option remaining was to starve it out. This was a risky plan, and although some of his advisors dissuaded him from doing so, because it was so late in the season and the long distances could cause problems supplying his own men, he chose to encircle Breda and starve its inhabitants into surrender. Spinola's plan could only work if he managed to seal the city off completely, so that neither food nor people could pass through. Accordingly, Spinola first began to surround the city. He divided the area around Breda in 4 compartments, each under 1 or 2 of his trusted commanders. On the 26th of August, 4,000 infantry and 1,000 horsemen seized Ginneken to establish a service area in the village. For that purpose, they occupied the church, the castle, the bridge, and several other buildings. At the same time, a detachment of 7,000 men, accompanied by some horsemen, went to Terheiden, from where they went to occupy the Hartelbergen, a dune south of the village. To hinder the Spanish from establishing this position near Breda, Justinus von Nassau sent 800 musketeers to the Hartelbergen. They held the dune for a short time until the Spanish cannons opened fire and a charge of the cavalrymen drove them back. Spinola himself, with 10,000 infantry and almost all horsemen, established his camp at Ginneken. These troops served as a general reserve to be deployed around Breda or in the supply corridor if necessary. Soon, the Spanish guns opened fire. As the Spaniards came ever closer to Breda, the garrison cleared the area around the town by burning buildings and cutting bushes and trees. That way, they had clear sight, and the area provided no cover for the attackers. When the 3 camps at Ginneken, Terheiden, and the Hartelbergen were ready, the Spaniards established a 4th at Teteringen and then cleared the Hage section. When this fortified camp had been established, Spinola's men began to dig a so-called contra and circumvallation. The circumvallation protected the besiegers against sorties and helped to seal the encirclement. The contravallation was about 300 meters further from the town and outside the camps, and protected the Spaniards against help from outside, for example a Dutch relief army. During the next weeks, the Spaniards constructed the definitive defensive works. Quite unusually, the groundwork was done by the soldiers themselves. However, this was work they despised, and only a generous extra on the pay could motivate them to pick up their shovels. So, basically, Spinola decided to build his own fortress around the fortress of Breda, or in other words, he fought fire with fire. The garrison of Breda didn't stand idle as they were confined bit by bit. They harassed the digging Spaniards whenever they could, and raided them regularly. During the first months of the siege, they made a sortie every 2 days. When the encirclement was completed, the numbers of sorties was somewhat reduced. For the Spaniards, this was both really annoying and threatening. When such a sortie was executed cleverly and efficiently, the risk of shoveling Spaniards getting caught on the wrong foot was very high. In such cases, they not only suffered high losses, but also risked being driven from their current position. The constant threat slowed down the earthwork massively, since the men always had to be on high alert. However, the sorties became fewer in spring 1625, and according to Francesco Pieri, an Italian in Spanish service, the Dutch did not resume them until after the 27th of February. Breda was not on its own in this fight. On the 10th of September, Maurits of Nassau entered the stage. After 20 days of marching his army, he crossed the river Donge over a pontoon bridge and arrived in Made. There, they established a fortified camp, from which they dug an approach trench towards the Spanish circumvallation. According to Francesco Pieri, the army of the States consisted of about 25,000 foot soldiers and 2,400 horsemen. While these were too few for a frontal attack, the presence of such a force within 3 to 4 kilometers of the Spanish defenses prevented Spinola from fully focusing on the city. He simply couldn't risk freeing up enough men for a storm assault. When news of the arriving force reached the Spanish commander, he ordered his men to finish and reinforce this side of the defenses. Like many other sieges of the time, the siege of Breda attracted numerous spectators. Among them was the Polish prince Władysław Wasa. He stayed in Brussels as a guest of Isabella, the governess of the Spanish Netherlands. When he wanted to visit the siege on the 25th of September, Isabella ordered Spinola to provide an escort of 1,000 horsemen to bring the prince to Breda safely. This was problematic since a large part of the Spanish cavalry was tied down by a rather unnecessary task. Frederick Henrik, the half-brother of Maurits, wrote in his memoirs that the Spanish would have been in trouble if Maurits had attacked at this moment. However, the attack never came, and in general, both sides actually avoided a decisive battle on open field. While the earthwork progressed relatively well, Spinola was facing his most difficult task. He had to supply his army over a considerable distance from Liers and later Herentals in present-day Belgium. The logistical challenge of transporting the mass of goods required was further complicated by Dutch soldiers constantly harassing the convoys. Consequently, large escorts had to be provided. According to ROOZE and EIMERMANN, 25,000 of the 80,000 soldiers under Spinola's command were employed for this task. From October 1624, they were commanded by Spinola's trusted general, Hendrik van den Berg, who had joined the siege in September. He had soldiers patrolling and guarding strategic points, such as crossings and waterways, while cavalry units were guarding the convoys. Additionally, infantrymen accompanied the transport vehicles. Maurits of Nassau was well aware that his army was not large enough to relieve Breda in a major attack. Thus, he had a considerable interest in interrupting the Spanish supply lines. This would force Spinola to lift the siege. so Mauritz's troops were regularly raiding the Spanish convoys, most importantly one cavalry detachment which was stationed in Vaud. However, to interrupt the Spanish supply lines completely, the Dutch had to capture Antwerp. On the night of the 12th to the 13th of October, a number of Mauritz's best men dressed up as Spanish soldiers and left for Antwerp. They were in wagons with Burgundian crosses on them, the sign of the Spanish. Covered by the dark and windy night, they reached the gates of the castle of Antwerp unnoticed. When they tried to break through the city gate, however, a Spanish guard discovered them and rang the alarm. The dressed-up Dutchmen immediately turned back and fled. A second try, somewhat later, was cancelled when the approaching Dutch saw fires on the rampart and thought they had been discovered. Antwerp remained in Spanish hands. Up to October 1624, the main route of supply was Lier, Antwerp, Ginneken. But on the 23rd of October, the camp of the Field Army of the Dutch Republic was moved from Made. One part under Maurits of Nassau set up camp near Bergen op Zoom, which was much better situated to attack passing convoys. The other, under his half-brother Frederik Henrik, went via Gertruidenberg to Sprang, northeast of Breda. Subsequently, the Spanish supply route was changed to Lier, Rijkevorsel, Ginneken. Because the warehouses in Lier were not big enough, additional depots were set up in Herentals, from where the convoys went to Ginneken via Turnhout. For safety reasons, the convoys travelled only in daylight and spent the nights in fortified towns. This meant that the shorter days of winter slowed down the transport significantly, and detours were required to reach a safe town before sundown. Organizational problems and poor roads hampered the supply so much that the besiegers suffered from hunger. One commander of the Spanish reserve allegedly noted that the garrison was fed better than his own men. While Spinola struggled to supply his men, the inhabitants of Breda were well fed. The food in stock was sufficient to nourish the garrison for the whole duration of the siege, and at the end of the struggle there were even some reserves left. The stock for the civil inhabitants was formidable as well. It only began to run low after 9 months. Only 2 things had gotten scarce quickly: tobacco and butter. Because of this, the number of smugglers sneaking past the Spanish lines under the cover of night was growing quickly. The trade with these goods was very lucrative and worth the risky journey for many. Smuggling was especially common in the early days of the siege, when the Spanish lines had not yet been finished. Also, by the way of smuggling, intelligence and letters were brought to and from the town. Delivering intelligence involved a higher risk, since caught messengers were usually not questioned in a very friendly manner. As the Spanish lines connected and the encirclement became completed, smuggling became very risky and only few managed to get out and in. By early December, it became clear that the States could not sufficiently hinder the supply of the Spanish to force them to lift the siege. However, the Dutch were well aware that their food wouldn't last forever. In consequence, Maurits decided to break through the lines in December and supply the town by ship. He chose the night of the 10th of December because then the moon was full and the water would be high, which made it possible to sail up the river Mark with large ships. But while the position of the moon was favorable, the wind was not. A stiff breeze blew towards the sea, and thus the water in the Mark was pushed out and was too shallow to sail on it with big ships. The attack had to be called off. An attempt to flood the area near Breda, which would make it navigable for loaded rowboats, also failed. Diseases such as dysentery and scurvy, on the other hand, were pretty common and spread quickly. These illnesses were facilitated by the high density of the population, whose resistance was decreasing due to food shortages and mediocre hygiene. Apart from these physical threats, paying the soldiers became a problem too. Because the garrison was numerous and the city soon cut off, the governor had trouble to find money to pay his soldiers in time. As a solution, the city council issued an order that all citizens be ordered to bring their silverware to the city hall, where various kinds of coins were minted from it. The 23rd of April 1625 was a bad day for the Dutch. Prince Maurits of Nassau died after a brief period of illness. But there was a shimmer of hope. Maurits was succeeded as commander of the army by his half-brother Frederick Henrik, who wanted to undertake a last effort to relieve the city. By and by, a large force of 40,000 infantrymen and 6,000 to 7,000 cavalrymen had gathered in Geertruidenberg. Spinola's intelligence informed him about this, but due to conflicting reports, he did not know whether 's-Hertogenbosch, the Tateringen section, or his supply lines would be the target. Spinola wanted to play it safe and had all possible points of attack reinforced. On the 2nd of May, the army of the States made its move, and one part, under Frederick Henrik, went to Schravenmuur, while Count Ernst von Mansfeld went to Dongen with the other part. Frederick Henrik held a council of war. He wanted to avoid an open field battle against Spinola's general reserve, and thus resorted to a surprise attack on the Ter Heiden section. The plan was as follows. An infantry detachment should occupy the village of Ter Heiden, after which a large force of cavalry would storm the Hartelbergen. In the meantime, the Count of Mansfeld was to carry out divisionary maneuvers at the Tateringen section. Once the Hartelbergen was taken, all obstacles on the Mark should be cleared and the fleet should sail to Breda to supply the town and relieve the garrison. 5,000 horsemen and 975 foot soldiers were selected as attacking force, while the rest of the army settled behind the natural barrier of the river Dong. On the 15th of May, the attacking force left for Ter Heiden. A first redoubt was taken with hand grenades, but the noise alarmed the Spanish. The next obstacle was the so-called tambour, a small outwork defending an entrance. One part of the attackers approached it frontally, while the other part went around its flank, captured an outwork nearby, and then attacked from the side. When the defenders saw this, they fled. The commander of the section then sent a company of Italian mercenaries to drive the attackers back. However, after a short and bloody fight, they had to give way to the hard-pressing Dutch, who marched forward and finally stood before the last trench and the corresponding wall. Because they had no storm ladders, they had to climb the rampart on all fours, while the Spaniards were stabbing them with their pikes from above. Despite being an easy target, the Dutch finally won the upper hand and slowly climbed the earthen wall. But right at this moment, when victory was nigh, Paolo Baglione, the commander of the Hartelbergen, arrived with an overwhelming force. The soldiers of the Dutch Republic had no choice but to retreat. After this failed attempt, Frederick Henrik retreated. On the 24th of May, he sent an encrypted letter to the governor of Breda, allowing him to surrender on the most favorable terms possible. This came at the right time, since there was only food for 11 days left in Breda. Spinola knew about this because he had decoded such a secret message. He did not want to wait for the city's offer of capitulation and sent a messenger to Breda requesting negotiations. Justinus of Nassau, quite boldly, sent the man back with a note that the town would soon be relieved. The same happened when Spinola sent a second messenger carrying the deciphered message the Spaniards had intercepted. Only when the third messenger arrived at the gates of Breda, Justinus accepted. After that, negotiations were held in a tent outside the city's fortifications. Spinola was quite courteous and accepted all of Justinus's conditions except for the request of religious freedom within the city after surrender. Breda surrendered on the 2nd of June 1625. On June 5th, the 3,000 remaining men of the garrison left the town armed with fluttering banners, drum rolls and trumpet blasts. Even before the siege of Breda came to an end, the Spanish Council of State decided that they wouldn't besiege Dutch towns anymore. The cost in men and material was too high. Still, this victory cleared Spinola's good name. After the siege, he was appointed Grand Commander of the Order of St. James by the Spanish King Philip IV. While the casualties of the field army of the Republic are unknown, the Spaniards lost about 12,000 men. As for Breda, historians estimate that about 38% of the garrison and 35% of the civilians died. The remaining Catholic inhabitants celebrated Spinola as liberator, while most Protestants left. For a long time, nobody took their place. In 1631, about 700 of the city's houses remained uninhabited. For several years, Breda had become a ghost town. If you like the way we present history, then please consider donating via Patreon. These videos take both a lot of time and effort to create, and a small tip allows us to cover more niche topics, like the siege of Breda.